Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me on this actually quite chilly winter's day here in Melbourne, where I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids either inside or outside without any equipment. So no greenhouses or grow lights or humidifiers, really just me and them struggling to find our rhythm together. So if that sounds like your bag, hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday. I am an amateur. Many things fail, but some things do work, and that might help you in your orchid journey. And today you might say, there is a table full of orchids, Matthew. Well, you are right, because it's midwinter. Actually, it's blue sky, but we're having a really cold winter here in Melbourne. It's relative, obviously, but there's actually quite a lot going on. And I thought I might just give you a little look at Australian Dendrobiums that I've got. It's midwinter to show you what some of them are doing at different stages of their growth cycle at this period, because actually all of them are doing something a little different. So let's take a midwinter check-in with Australian Dendrobiums. And most of these are hybrids, some are species, but there's, a lot of similarities for us to look at. And I know that the Aussie Dendrobiums are quite popular in other parts of the world. And I also know there's not a huge amount of information out there about them. So I'm probably in my fifth year, I can't remember now, of flowering and growing these types of orchids. And my collection is growing. This is a tiny selection. So a few learnings. I'm going to share what's going on, what I've learned, and maybe it will help you. First, a quick geography lesson. I think it's important to understand that none of these Australian Dendrobiums or the species origins of these hybrids grow anywhere near me here in Melbourne. So I'm quite far south in Australia, and most of the distribution of the Dendrobiums of Australia starts quite a bit further north along the east coast for me. So all the way up from the north of my state, but through to New South Wales and Queensland, which is that pointy bit on the top right of Australia. So none of these should be here. However, most of them do really well in my southern climate, which is cooler, and we have obviously cooler winters and not as hot summers, and certainly not that humidity and subtropical environment that many of those orchids do experience further up the coast. But as you can see, they're all loving life, which makes them quite versatile and I think quite easy to grow. But I think a bit of a challenge inside if you can only grow them inside. But I don't know, because I've never really grown them inside, because I am blessed with a temperate climate here in Melbourne where they can survive quite happily outside all year. So a few generalizations, let's just say they generally flower in late winter, early spring. However, there's some blooms, so we'll get to that. The other thing is they only flower once a year. Asterisks, there are exceptions. So a lot of these plants can be quite bulky, which is quite a lot of space for something that only flowers once a year. But if you get it right, the flower display is amazing, because you can get multiple racemes from each cane and you can get just a cloud of beautiful flowers and colors. So they do make quite an amazing statement when they bloom, but often as well, the flowers don't last that long. Asterisks, there are exceptions, like this one behind me. So you got to kind of weigh it up. A lot of space for a one-time bloomer for flowers that often don't last that long. But if you've got the space and you don't care about those practical difficulties, they are a stunning orchid, and a lot of them are fragrant as well, and beautifully fragrant and amazing colors. So it's a beautiful group of orchids. There's a lot of breeding going on, obviously, here in Australia, but also elsewhere, to produce all sorts of amazing varieties and colors. So we're going to have a look at the ones I've got and just see where they're all at, and maybe a little bit of explanation around the fact that some things are doing things like flowering, while others really aren't. Okay, first, cab off the rank though, is names. You know I love a little bit of nomenclature, carry on. Dendrobium, I'm sure everyone knows, comes from the Greek meaning tree and life, i.e. it's describing an epiphyte, so an orchid that lives on a tree, not parasitical, but on it. But a lot of these Australian ones are also lithophytes, which means they can live on rocks. And I think interesting or important to understand with both of those, epiphytes and lithophytes, a lot of Australian orchids can be both, because they can find similar conditions on either structure, be it a tree or a rock, and that they are not clingers. Now, I made a video a few weeks ago about an orchid I saw growing in Bali, and that is a real clinger. The roots work their way through the moss and the bark of the trunk of the tree, and cling like that. These orchids tend to be found more in nooks where some matter has collected and they've got a little bit of an area to get their roots in. So it's almost like they're sort of pot bound in a little nook. So you can imagine that in the fork of a tree or an area where a branch has fallen off, or even towards the bottom at the trunk where it's spreading out, and little niches occur where matter collects. Great habitat for these. There are some Australian Dendrobiums that are sort of clingers that are living in the moss, but most of these and the species they came from are not. And similarly with lithophytes, so that would suggest it's clinging to rock like some alien beast. Well, again, they're often in cracks in the rock where moss has collected, which will collect leaves and other little bits of detritus. So there is a little bit of an environment there for soil to build up where those plants live. Obviously, though, given that it's rock, very contained, ain't nowhere to go. And also that means all of these plants are subject to wet, dry, wet, dry, wet, dry conditions, because obviously as it rains, either the tree or the rock is going to get covered in moisture, which the plant can uptake. But then the minute the sun comes out, that will evaporate. And particularly here in Australia, that is the case. It will dry out very quickly and then it rains again. And depending where you are up the coast, some, as we get further north, it is tropical at the very top with a monsoonal weather pattern. And then further south you get it's subtropical, and then temperate, sort of Mediterranean, depends how far you go, but not so clearly defined dry and wet seasons. Obviously, it tends to rain a lot less the further south you come in summer. Massive generalizations. The other thing is in winter in Australia, the sun is much lower, so there's more penetration into the sort of the forest and the basis of trees. But of course, none of the forests on the east coast are deciduous. So they're generally eucalypt or conifer, and none of them shed their leaves. So we don't have those vast swathes of deciduous forests that other countries have. So the light that these orchids get is fairly consistent. It's dappled, and eucalypts tend not to have dense canopies. So there's always a bit of light penetration. And then in winter, the light is lower and it's penetrating sort of lower and deeper. So most of these are going to get more light in winter, which is important. So perhaps the most famous of the Aussie Dendrobiums are speciosum, Dendrobium speciosum, and speciosum means, surprise, surprise, beautiful, splendid, magnificent. So Dendrobium speciosum. The next, perhaps most common one, is Dendrobium kingianum, which was named after Mr. King. Speciosum is the large, beautiful, almost boughs of yellow, sometimes quite pale cream, but in that sort of colorway of flowers, stunning, amazing fragrance. Kingianum tends to be quite a deep mauve, going all the way to quite light pink, almost a sort of whitey pink, much smaller plant and finer sprays of flowers. And then perhaps the other most common one to find in cultivation is Dendrobium delicatum, which is a natural hybrid between speciosum and kingianum. So it's kind of got a bit of both characteristics. Much bigger plant. The sprays are bigger of flowers, but the flower looks more like a large kingianum flower, I think, than a speciosum flower, and the most delicious fragrance. And they tend to be on the very pale pink, almost to sort of whitey pink spectrum. So they're kind of the three main ones that crop up and that are hybridized, but then there are other orchids that are quite common to be used in the cross to create hybrids. So we'll go through each of those as we look at each plant, because it does give you clues as to what's going on and what to expect from your orchid. So first thing, flowering. Everyone wants to know when it's going to flower and how. Now we are in midwinter, so it's kind of the time for lots of species and hybrids derived thereof to be putting out there or developing their flower buds. So I've got an array of orchids that are doing just that. Now I'm just going to drop in some footage here. This is my Dendrobium speciosum. Just a little too big for me to move right now, but I will come back and do a video about each one when the flowers open. But anyway, so Dendrobium speciosum for me is in bud right now, and you can see they're really fat, juicy, very bright lime green buds. Now speciosum is an orchid that really has seasons and cycles of flowering. Last year I had none, no flowers at all. The year before it was covered in flowers. It was just a mass like a golden waterfall. And I did ask around, and quite a few other growers said, yeah, last year, really bad year for speciosum. So that's something to bear in mind. You're not going to get consistent results. This year, I think it's halfway. So a lot of the canes have got a couple of buds coming out, which means you get two racemes on each cane. We'll get to that though in a minute. Others look like they're not. So I think it's going to be an okay year, but not a great year. Now, Dendrobium kingianum, also at this time of year, is producing some flowers for me. Now, this is an interesting one. This is a plant that I got from a friend, and she bought a hill station house in a place called Macedon, Mount Macedon, which is to the northwest of Melbourne. Inland, quite cold winters. In fact, you actually get a bit of snow sometimes up there. I mean, very thin, and it melts quickly, but nonetheless, it is much colder than Melbourne in winter and cooler in summer. And the house and the garden have been overgrown for a long, long time. And the house, I think, was built in the 1880s, which is quite old for Australia. Anyway, in the sort of lurking about in the conservatory was this, well, parent of this, and it looks very classically Dendrobium kingianum like, except it's much smaller than the kingianums that I've got. So I'm curious. Now, my friend gave me a bit because she'd never seen it bloom and she couldn't get it to bloom up there. And I've had it for a couple of years and it's put on lots of amazing growth. And this is the first year that it's flowering. So there is the flower spike just there, which is very, very exciting. So I'm curious to see what this one's going to do. But basically, classic Dendrobium kingianum should be putting on its spikes right now. And when I get to a bigger plant, I'll zoom in and show you just where and how the flowers emerge. But anyway, so this is a Dendrobium kingianum. I presume, don't know, very curious to see what the flower is. And this is from a very old plant that would have been cultivated in that garden. I don't know when, but I mean, at least 40 years ago, but perhaps earlier. There was a real moment when these orchids started to be grown in the 80s here in Australia. Anyway, I'm curious to see what this one is. And just to have the word of authority, here we are, The Orchids of Australia by W.H. Nichols, the most amazing book, which I got in a thrift store. I've used it often, but so fantastic. Of course, a lot of names have changed, but the information is still great. So let's just see what it says about kingianum. Kingianum grows exclusively and usually in extensive mats on cliff faces or in rock crevices, and is often remarkably abundant in the vicinity of waterfalls. And its flowering period is August to November. Now here in the Southern Hemisphere, that is midwinter to early-ish spring. So there you go. Gives you a bit of an idea what kingianum likes. It likes to be pot bound. It's a lithophyte, but it does very well in pot culture. And all of these, I've made lots of potting videos about Australian Dendrobiums, but I actually just use out of the bag orchid mix, which is sort of a medium bark with a little bit more grit. And they all generally seem to love that. Whatever you're potting them in though, free draining. That is the key, and keep the plant pot bound. It wants to be quite contained. So buds forming, that little plant, this kingianum we see has just got a tiny little beginning of an inflorescence. So it's about 1 centimeter long. Now this one here, which I shall bring down, this I'm very excited about because look at those flower spikes there. So you can see how long they are. So they're much more advanced than the plant we were just looking at. So this is probably, you know, an earlier flowering species or hybrid, and that's what we'll find out, that a lot of them are flowering at all sorts of different periods, not just that classic sort of late winter, early spring, but this is a beauty. Now, this one is a hybrid, and it's a cross between Dendrobium amberbanks Albury and, wow, Ceinwein. Let me just show you that. There we go. So the hybrid doesn't have a name, although I haven't actually checked, so maybe it does. And this came from an orchid seller who is in a similar climate to mine, and I'll put the link below. It's called Orchids on Newbold, and they sort of specialize in a lot of Australian orchids, but also cymbidiums and other sort of cooler growing orchids. What we can see is that each cane has got 2 inflorescences coming out, which is quite common. I mean, sometimes you can get 3, depends on which plant you're looking at. And then the other sort of interesting thing is just to see where the flower spikes actually come from. So it depends on the age of the cane. Now, all of these Australian Dendrobiums, the flowering is initiated from that top part, from the apex. There are lots of insects that like to lay their eggs in there, and actually the larvae will chew it out. So if that happens, you're probably never going to get blooms from that cane, which can be really annoying. Anyway, depends how far they munch down. So you get your flower spikes either at the apex, just at in the middle of the 2 top leaves, or in between the junction of the leaves just below. And so on this cane, and I'll come in and show you closer, we've actually got 2 spikes coming out of the very tip of the cane, and then a little bud here, which you can see is coming out of the just above the node of a leaf. So anywhere in that sort of top inch or top couple of centimeters of the cane of the plant is where the flower spikes are going to come from. And of course, all of these dendrobiums can flower in successive seasons from the same cane. So some orchids will only flower once from the new growth, like a cymbidium, for example, or oncidiums. However, these will continue to flower. So even if your canes start to look really scabby and dead and leafless, but the cane is still green, don't give up, as Kate Bush said, because you might still get flowers. So resist the urge to trim off dead canes until you're sure that they're dead and they can't ever flower again. Now, the next plant I want to show you is this one. Look at all the fabulous growth on that. This is from a nursery that is unfortunately closed down, which is very sad. It's a common tale, though, amongst sort of specialist horticulturalists that a lot of people are retiring and leaving the industry. This is quite a complex hybrid between a kingianum variety, and that cross was red devil and red ink, and a cross between speciosum windermere and raspberry ripple. So I think we can assume this is going to be a sort of a mauvey purple flower. I'm not sure that I've seen this flower anyway, or I've forgotten. Now, what I wanted to show you in this one is that we've got quite a lot sort of going on in the apex of these canes. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 old flower spikes, and yet what you can just see there is the initiation of this season's flowers. So that's 4 years worth of flowering from this cane. Just emphasizing that point that these canes can keep on giving. Now, the other thing about this one is that these flower spikes, or flower buds as they're sort of beginning to come out, are quite a specific color. They're kind of like almost like a mahogany burgundy color. So quite different. And I'll just drop in the footage of speciosum now, and you can see they are bright lime green, really fat and juicy looking buds, whereas these are sort of much more, yeah, of a browny burgundy color. So when you're looking to see, is my orchid initiating flower spikes, the colors aren't always consistent in terms of what's coming out. This one I am really looking forward to seeing when the flowers come out. Now, of course, the other thing that's going on right now is flowers. Now, isn't that odd? Because you'd kind of think, way too early. This is the most beautiful hybrid, and it's quite commonly found. It is called Dendrobium jessamine sparkler Greg Hall. Now, this is the time for us to do a little digging into the origin of the species, as Mr. Darwin would have said, and just try and understand, why is this flowering now? And this flower opened about a month ago, so when it was still autumn. Early. Why? And the answer lies in the species ancestors of this one. So we just mentioned at the beginning those species, those 3 ones, speciosum, kingianum, delicatum, that are most commonly used in hybrids. But there are a few others, and they will give a little bit of their gene, which might just affect how often and when the plant flowers. So this particular hybrid, which is very popular, and you can see why, just look at those splashes of pink on that beautiful gold flower. Stunning thing, and no fragrance, but it's a bit of a miserable day, although the sun's out anyway. So if it was going to be fragrant, it would be. So that one, alas, isn't. But there we are. Aren't those flowers stunning and really quite big as well? Beautiful. Now, the important thing with this is the species ancestors. And surprise, surprise, Dendrobium kingianum is one of the species ancestors. And there are 3 others, though. Another one is delicatum, which I mentioned before. And then the other 2 species ancestors for this one, Dendrobium tetragonum and Dendrobium falcarostrum. So let's have a little look at what the Bible of Australian orchids says about those 2 species to indicate perhaps why this one chooses to flower a little earlier. So what are those species? Dendrobium falcarostrum, and falcarostrum sounds like falcon. And yes, it is named after the bird because the flower, apparently part of it looks like the beak of that bird. That species is a high altitude plant from further north, but it obviously can take much cooler conditions. And it flowers from August to October, which is midwinter to early spring. Now, the other ancestor was Dendrobium tetragonum, and tetra, 4, that is referring to the shape of the cane, which kind of has 4 distinct sides. And you can see on a lot of these canes that they are quite ridged and do have, in some cases, quite a defined form. So tetragonum is very defined in 4 elements. So that is a widespread plant, not in my region, but from both the coast up into the mountains, and it flowers May to September. Now here in Australia, May is autumn and September is the beginning of spring, so that is much earlier flowering. So there you go. It is June right now, and this plant has been in bloom since May. So clearly, part of that ancestry of the species plant has enabled this one to bloom earlier than some of its other hybrid cousins, which are still well away from actually developing the spikes yet. They're still just little buds, little ideas in the crown of the canes. Now, the other one that's in bloom is this one behind me, which I've mentioned many a time before. I bought it over a year ago, and there was a lot of concern because the leaves, some of them are quite damaged, but it is sun damage, not a virus. And a viewer pointed out that this hybrid now has a name, and it's called Dendrobium Gippsland. So thank you for that. It's great. The community here that knows so many things can share information. So Dendrobium Gippsland is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful flower. Mine isn't fragrant, alas, but the flowers are massive and really, really beautiful. And I will hold up Jesmond Sparkler Greg Hall, and you'll be able to see how similar in form the flowers are, but this one is just much bigger. Now, I didn't know much about this hybrid at all, and I bought it in bloom at the time of year when you'd expect, which was late winter, early spring. And then it surprised me in autumn by putting on all these flower spikes, and these flowers have been perfect for now well over a month. It's been in bloom for quite a while. So very early autumn did it start to put up its spikes, and it's been in bloom all the way through autumn and now into winter, and there are still some spikes left to open. So perhaps the species ancestors of Gippsland will reveal why it is flowering and has been well in flower for the last month. So the ancestors of that are, surprise, surprise, Dendrobium speciosum and Dendrobium kingianum. The third species ancestor is Dendrobium tetragonum, which we've also come across, slightly earlier flowerer. But the most important clue is the other ancestor, which is Dendrobium bigibbon, and that is a flower. I'll tell you what it does. And as the book says, it is probably Australia's showiest and best known orchids, and it does look a bit like a Phalaenopsis orchid, and it is native to the north of the country and also to New Guinea, so it certainly likes warmer weather. And flowering time almost continuously from January to November. So basically there's 1 month when it's not in bloom, which is December, midsummer. So basically any point throughout the year it can flower. So depending on the hybrid you've got and depending which gene is sort of being triggered at whatever point, this orchid can basically flower multiple times throughout the year. And the other viewers who have this have pointed that out, that theirs does bloom multiply throughout the year, which mine certainly has because it flowered in spring and then it's flowered in autumn. So there you go. Not all of them only flower once a year. So the important thing is to try and find out what the ancestors perhaps are of the hybrid that you've got, and then you can understand what it should be doing at particular times of the year and when you can expect flowers. And a good way to search for that, to find out the information, is orchids.org or orchidroots.com. And that will, if you put the name of the hybrid in, it will give you all the species ancestors. And then you can research, once you find out the ancestor list, what the characteristics are and what your orchid might have. And then another thing that's going on at this time of year is growth. So yes, although it's midwinter, as you can see here, this is a brand new cane that's just emerged and is just maturing. Now this is a pot of delicatum keikis, and I think there were 2 canes, obviously with quite small and not very well developed root systems, which is why I have a little cane and a little tie to that cane to keep it upright in the pot. But it has thrown out 4 new growths in the space of a year, and it's now very much filled the pot. It's very stable, and you can see the roots are coming out of the pot. And in fact, it's already started to distort the pot because it's really bulking out. They do have quite vigorous root systems. So midwinter, and this one is still just maturing, this beautiful cane. And I wonder, this probably could flower next year for me. And the only reason I potted it up is I just feel so bad throwing away keikis. So when this is in bloom, I'll give it away to someone. Very easy orchid to look after. And then the last plant we're going to look at is this baby here, which is most probably a Dendrobium speciosum hybrid or variety thereof. And I bought this one and I made a video about it when I was repotting it a couple of months ago, and it was on sale. It's half price because there was no flowers on it, and it was in a bit of bad condition. You can perhaps see how some of those canes, don't quite know what happened. Looks like it was dropped in a chopper. Anyway, but what you can see right there is a beautiful, fresh, juicy new growth. So here we are, midwinter, and this growth has just decided to put itself out there. So generally though, you'd be getting new growths in spring and they'd sort of mature over the warmer period. But this one has decided to grow now, even though it is cold and wet and miserable. Now, I don't think I'm going to get blooms on this one this year, which is annoying because I'm curious to see. There are some of the buds that look a little swollen, which could mean they're about to develop, but Anyway, jury's out on this to see whether it will bloom for me. Sometimes things do sulk the year after you've potted them up, but the new growth means that it's very happy. So I'm curious to see what this one has in store for us. And the last thing to show you really is this little baby here, which is not an Australian Dendrobium. This is Dendrobium atriviolaceum, and this is a New Guinea orchid. And this is really famous for its incredible frilly flowers, which you'll know immediately when you Google it. But I just wanted to show you the plant. This is a seedling. It's a warm grower, so this does not live outside. Only in summer I put it out, but it comes in winter. And I was just wanting to show you the growth really. So it doesn't really look like its Australian cousins. I mean, it's a vague similarity, but it does have a similar flowering habit in that the flowers come out from the top of the cane and it can flower multiple years from the same cane. And the other delightful thing is, well, I have these 3 new growths, which were last season's. That one got a bit nibbled because I did put it out in summer. But what we can see just growing in there is a new cane. So again, midwinter, and this one is putting on its growth, although it is inside, so it's a lot warmer. But I'm very excited about this, and I wonder how old this needs to be to flower. Looks to me like these canes could have offered something anyway, so I'm excited about that. So there we are, plant lovers, Australian Dendrobiums and what they're doing in deepest midwinter, which is a bit of everything: in bloom, in bud, maturing growths, initiating growths, kind of everything. It all depends on the species and the species ancestors of the hybrid you've got and what it does in particular seasons. And just a quick care recap, because I've done this before. Mine are all in terracotta. You can use whatever you want. I use a out-of-the-bag orchid mix for these because it's inexpensive and all of my Australian orchids love it, which is medium bark, a bit gritty. Free draining. I water them reasonably, but certainly in winter less. They deal with my hot temperatures and they deal with the winter and nighttime minimums, even if they're wet. It's a really tough orchid. But the most important thing is light. Let there be light. These plants will not flower for you if you don't give them really good winter light. And ideally, that is direct light. Not perhaps in the afternoon, because you will get a lot of leaf damage. And as we read in some of these descriptions, particularly the rock orchids, they're in full sun and the leaves are really damaged and eaten and burnt by the sun, but they flower incredibly. So you've got to kind of find that compromise in terms of growing them for horticulture, that your leaves are getting enough light, but they're not burnt because they'll look terrible. And fertilizing, I don't tend to fertilize these as much as the other types of orchids I grow. So I do give them a topical dressing in spring. And then if I remember, I'll give them a liquid fertilizer throughout the growing season, but sometimes not. I feel that these orchids do very well without too much food. The only other little tidbit of information is that, as we heard, a lot of these plants are lithophytic, so they grow on rocks. So a lot of growers do use a little bit of lime occasionally in their watering. So you can get all sorts of products that will do that for you. But you can actually just get garden lime and you can sprinkle that on the top, or you can dilute that in water. So I have a fragmopedium, which I use a little bit of lime in quite regularly. And so whenever I'm watering that, the leftover water of that, I will put on some of these Dendrobiums, particularly the speciosum, because that very much is the Sydney rock orchid. But again, there are also people that don't use lime at all in their propagation of these Aussie natives. So I wouldn't worry too much. But if you want to give it a go, it won't hurt, just not huge amounts, and infrequently is what I do. So there we are, plant lovers. Gee whiz, we have covered a lot of ground with Aussie Dendrobiums. Now, if you are growing them indoors, two most important things are they do need that cooler differentiation between the seasons. So as we go into autumn, often it's that cooler weather, the shorter day that triggers flowering. And most importantly, light, sunlight, bright light in winter. So if you are growing them in pot culture indoors all year, just find somewhere in winter where they're gonna get a little bit of a chill at night and they're gonna get bright sun. So ideally against a window, so they get a little bit of cold through the glass. It'll keep them a little bit cooler and they're gonna get bright indirect light through the window, or bright direct light, in fact. And that would be the best spot, I think, to grow them indoors. So there you are, plant lovers. We have covered a lot of ground. I hope wherever you are, your Aussie Dendrobiums are doing what they should be doing. And if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, that won't be much. But if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, they're either blooming or growing or sending up spikes. Do let me know what yours are up to. And I am filming each one of these as the blooms come out. So I will put together a sort of compendium of the Aussie Dendrobiums when they're out and about. Now, some of mine are just too big to move. So it'll be not necessarily in the flesh, but I will show you all the different flowers because they are so exciting and so beautiful, so easy to grow, particularly here in Melbourne. They just take conditions outside. They can be under a tree and get rained on all year. They don't really mind. But thank you for watching. And if you want to know what we might be covering next week, hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday. Hit the notification bell if you want to know exactly when my missive pops into the ether. And I look forward to seeing you next week.